Hi there, Walker from Timbertone here. Welcome to the workshop. In this video, I make a turned handle backscratcher. I saw this little gem at a woodworking supplier, and it just gave me the perfect excuse to give the new turning tools a spin. So I'm going to turn my standard tool handle for it, but swap in a brass collet in place of a copper one. And I've chosen spotted gum as the timber, as I just think this combination looks great. So out with the story stick to start prepping the stock. The blank isn't perfectly square, but I'll still be able to get away with a chuck mount. So after it's docked to length, only one side gets a centre mark. This is to locate the live centre in the tailstock. I'm also setting the outside gauges for the different diameters of the project as well. And with these ready, the stick goes in the lathe. There's a bit of slop in the blank in the chuck's jaws, but it's close enough to get tapped into centre before clamping down. And with the timber set in the lathe, we can begin. I'll be starting with a roughing gouge to get the length of the blank down to basically a cylinder. The stock was pretty close to the largest final dimension on the shorter length, so I'm not going to go the whole way. Just enough to get the story stick back on to mark out the rest of the material removal. The notches on the stick indicate the different sections of the handle. These are transferred onto the blank to make it easier to identify where to start or stop a certain diameter when the piece is turning. With the marks now transferred, I'm going to use a parting tool along with the outside gauges to depth in different areas. Each of the dimensions on the story stick relate to a different diameter on the handle, and this becomes a bit more apparent now that they've been turned into the blank. Then, using a spindle gouge, the handle's shape really gets exposed. The diameters of the different sections are joined and blended together, ready for some further cleanup. And to do this, I'm using a skew chisel. This tool makes a paring cut, which leaves a cleaner surface finish than the gouge, but it's still not perfect. The interlocked grain of the spotted gum has torn out in places from the gouges, which the skew helps with, but to really refine the surface shape and remove the tear out, I'm finishing with a scraper. Taking light cuts with the scraper removes minimal material, and the cutting angle allows for this to be done with zero tear out. So lastly, it's time to fit the ferrule. Carefully, the size is snuck up on and tested before the rest of the material is turned off. With the turning completed for now, it's time to start sanding. The grits are progressively worked through along the length of the handle up to a 240 finish. Then, a quick sanding along the grain removes the last of the striations. And before removing the handle, I'm indexing it to the chuck for later. Now I went a bit ham when turning the ferrule down and took an extra couple of shavings. This resulted in about 0.5 millimeter of annular space. But I'm using epoxy for the bond, so this won't be an issue. Some quick persuasion with a mallet seats the ferrule in place for the epoxy to cure. And once that's done, it's time to dress the ferrule back at the lathe. I'm using a carbide cutter to create a square shoulder at the tip of the ferrule and then remove this sharp outer edge with a round over. Any excess epoxy is then dressed off before creating a round over where the ferrule meets the handle. Now we're on the home stretch to cut the handle off the lathe. Starting with the parting tool at the ferrule end, the remaining material is turned right down to the live centre before moving to the other end and forming what will be the butt of the handle. The butt is turned down with a slight convex curvature, and enough material is removed to provide clearance for a round cutter to allow the edges to be rounded over for neatness. And with the turning completed, the ferrule and butt end get to polishing with 400 grit sandpaper, ready to accept the finish. Now for finish, I'm using beeswax. It's not the hardiest product, but is usually pretty readily available, fast to apply to the piece, and in the lathe, burnishes very easily and quite well. So with that done, it's time to separate the handle from its mount. Before removing it from the lathe, the end is turned down to bare minimum, and then this is cut off with a flush saw. Any remaining marks are pared off, and a beeswax based polish is applied to the raw timber and burnished off to finish the handle. Great. Now the scratcher is actually two pieces, a threaded bush for mounting and the cast hand for scratching. The length of this handle maxes out my lathe bed, meaning I have to drill out the handle at the bench. So, carefully using the centre point from the lathe, the handle is drilled out to suit the bush, and I only need a tiny amount of epoxy for this fit, so a graduated syringe works perfectly to accurately measure the ratio. So with the epoxy on, the bush gets pushed into place and any excess is wiped away. Then, to ensure there's no movement over the curing time, a clamp is lightly pressed on. Perfect. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little project. See you later.